There is a specific sound that stone makes right before it shatters from the heat, a low, rhythmic groan that echoes like a final cry. In the year 70, within the burning core of Jerusalem, 10,000 Roman legionaries heard that sound and realized their victory was a terminal trap. They were encased in a stone furnace where the air was thick with the scent of scorched cedar and the heavy, metallic weight of a city's end. As the temple gold began to soften and run down the walls in shimmering, unrelenting rivers, the world's most disciplined force did something the history books prefer to omit. They shed their civilization and surrendered to a primal darkness. How did a structured military campaign transform into a collapse so absolute that the survivors chose silence over memory? The air in Jerusalem had become a physical weight, a thick and sweet miasma that clung to the throat like wet wool and refused to be exhaled. It was the scent of 70 days of stagnation, a suffocating mixture of parched earth, unwashed desperation, and the heavy, metallic scent of iron that had long since settled into the porous limestone of the streets. Every breath felt like a betrayal of the lungs, a forced consumption of the city's slow unraveling that left a residue on the tongue and a film of grit upon the skin. The legionaries of the 10th and the 15th stood in their trenches, but they did not look like the Iron Men who had conquered the known world. They were statues of gray grit, their bronze armor tarnished by a salt spray of sweat and a fine, persistent coating of lime dust that turned their eyelashes white and their skin into a cracked porcelain mask. They stared at the city not with the hunger of predators, but with the hollow, vibrating gaze of men who had begun to suspect that the walls they were battering were not made of stone, but of a collective, unyielding madness that could not be breached by any ram. Jerusalem was no longer a collection of markets and houses. It had transformed into a vertical monument of silence, a jagged ascent of terraces and towers where those who remained and those who had already fallen occupied the same cramped, suffocating space. Every narrow alleyway seemed to lead upward into a sky that refused to grant the mercy of rain, and every darkened window felt like a silent throat, watching the Roman lines with a predatory patience. The geometric order of the Roman camp, with its perfect squares and rhythmic watchfires, felt fragile and absurd against the chaotic, rising mass of the city that seemed to grow taller with every passing night. Above the ruins sat the temple, a mountain of white marble and gold that caught the dying light of the afternoon sun with a brilliance that felt like an assault. It was too bright, too silent, a monument of such blinding purity that it seemed to mock the grit and the stagnation of the trenches below. The sun, hanging heavy and swollen like a bruised fruit over the Judean hills, cast long, distorted shadows that stretched toward the Roman lines like reaching fingers, claiming the ground before a single soldier could move. The light did not reveal the city, it interrogated it, exposing the rot beneath the gold. A strange vibration had begun to ripple through the earth, not the thunder of a catapult or the rhythmic stomp of a march, but a low, subterranean groan that made the horses restless and the water in the leather skins tremble. It was the sound of a structural integrity failing, not just in the buildings, but in the very logic of the campaign. The veteran centurions, men who had survived the devastation of the Germanic forests and the heat of the Egyptian deserts, found themselves checking the straps of their sandals and the grip of their swords with trembling hands. They were waiting for a signal that never came, realizing with a cold, creeping dread that the laws of war had been suspended. The silence of the defenders was not the silence of the defeated. It was the stillness of a spring being coiled to the point of snapping, a pause in the physics of survival that suggested the coming collision would not be a battle, but a total, irreversible erasure of everything they understood about victory. Something in the foundation of the world had already shifted, and though the walls still stood, the end had already begun to breathe. The victory was not a matter of courage, but of geometry and the cold, unblinking application of architectural force. Inside the command tent of Titus, the maps spread across the cedar tables were not mere drawings, but blueprints for an inevitable conclusion. A series of concentric circles closing around a singular, doomed point. To the Roman staff, the siege of Jerusalem was a mathematical problem that had already been solved in the abstract. All that remained was the physical labor of moving the decimal point through the grit in the stone. They relied on the disciplina militaris, a system where every man was a cog, every unit a lever, and every legion a massive, unstoppable piston designed to convert time into conquest. This was the logic of the empire, that chaos could be tamed by the grid, that rebellion was an error of the mind, and that the legion was the precision instrument required to remove it. They had already systematically dismantled the first and second walls, treating the city like an onion to be peeled layer by layer until the heart was exposed. There was a profound, sedative comfort in this process, a sense of divine rightness that came from the rhythmic thud of the hammers and the precise calibration of the torsion engines. The catapults and onagers were not weapons of passion. They were instruments of survey, measuring the structural integrity of the Jewish masonry with every 80-pound stone they hurled into the crowded streets. The soldiers in the ranks felt this certainty in the weight of their equipment and the regularity of their daily bread. They were part of a civilization that built roads across deserts and moved rivers to suit its needs. A single city, no matter how ancient or supposedly holy, could not stand against the cumulative weight of Roman history. The system was designed to absorb failure and convert it into data. If a ramp collapsed under a sortie, they built a larger one of earth and timber. If a siege tower was burned by the defenders, they plated the next in hammered iron. This was the terrifying reliability of the Roman way. It did not require the spark of individual genius, only the relentless, unblinking adherence to a proven method that had swallowed Carthage, Corinth, and the tribes of the north. The command for the final breach of the Antonia fortress and the subsequent push toward the temple was viewed not as a gamble, but as the final movement in a long, predictable symphony of steel. The officers believed that once the walls were breached, the superior weight of the heavy infantry would act like a hydraulic press, clearing the streets with the same mechanical efficiency they had used to clear the open fields of the world. The narrowness of the city streets was noted on the parchment maps, but it was dismissed as a secondary factor, a mere inconvenience that would be corrected by the sheer forward momentum of the advance. They assumed that the enemy, trapped and deprived of hope, would follow the universal laws of human psychology and break once their inner sanctum was violated. It was a reasonable assumption, backed by centuries of triumph over 100 different nations, who had all eventually bowed to the logic of the sword. The Roman world was a world of straight lines and right angles, a world where every problem had a physical solution, and every rebellion had a price that could be calculated in silver or sacrifice. They marched into the shadows of the lower city with the absolute, unshakable conviction that the geometry of the legion was the only geometry that mattered, unaware that they were moving from a world of maps into a world of shadows, where the rules of the grid were about to be neutralized. The sun glinted off 60,000 helmets, a shimmering river of bronze that believed it could never be contained, moving with the heavy, rhythmic cadence of a machine that had forgotten how to stop. They were the masters of the horizon, the architects of the earth, and they looked upon the final barriers of the city as if they were already ruins, confident that their order was an eternal law of nature that no amount of religious fervor could ever hope to overturn. Every centurion carried a vine staff, a symbol of his power to maintain order through discipline, and as they stepped through the shattered gates, they held those staves high, believing that even the madness of Jerusalem would eventually bow to the rhythm of Roman authority. They were the heirs of Romulus, the sons of Mars, and they believed the stone under their feet would always remain solid, that the sky would always remain clear, and that the path to the temple was simply the final stretch of a road that led directly to a triumph in the streets of Rome. This was the height of their clarity, the peak of their systemic perfection. And as the first files disappeared into the gloom of the narrow alleyways, the silence of the city felt not like a threat, but like a surrender to the inevitable mathematics of the empire. The officers watched from the heights of the Antonia, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords, with the relaxed grip of men who had already written the history of the day. They saw the legions enter the maze of the lower city, not as men walking into a trap, but as a tide flowing into a basin. The density of the formation, which had served them so well on the plains of Gaul and the sands of Africa, was seen as their ultimate shield. They believed that the sheer mass of the Roman column would act as a psychological hammer, shattering the resolve of the defenders before a single blow was struck. In their minds, the city had already fallen. The smoke rising from the distance was merely the incense of their impending celebration, and the cries echoing from the alleyways were nothing more than the fading echoes of a world that had failed to understand the power of the Roman line. This was the perfection of their arrogance, a structural flaw in the foundation of their confidence that was as invisible to them as it was total. They had mapped the stones, they had counted the days, and they had calculated the resources required to exhaust a population. But they had failed to account for a geography that was not composed of earth and wood, but of a metaphysical fury that did not obey the laws of physics. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long, needle-like shadows across the white marble of the temple, the Roman machine continued to grind forward, fueled by the belief that the world was a place of predictable outcomes and that their order was the only truth left in a world of chaos. They were the masters of the known, the conquerors of the visible, and as they pushed deeper into the suffocating intimacy of the city, they felt the weight of their own armor as a reassurance, a physical proof of their invincibility that would soon become their iron enclosure. The transition from the lightless, constricting veins of the lower city to the expansive, blinding plateau of the outer court felt, at first, like the triumphant resolution of a nightmare. After days of fighting for every inch of vertical space, the legions finally spilled out into the vast, paved expanse that surrounded the sanctuary, a space designed for the movement of thousands. The centurions instinctively began to signal for the reformation of the ranks, their voices hoarse from the dust and the clamor, reaching for the familiar comfort of the line in the interval. They expected the resistance to stiffen here, to meet a final, desperate wall of steel in the open, where Roman training could finally be brought to bear with surgical precision. Instead, they found a vacuum. The defenders did not stand to meet them in the traditional sense. They drifted backward like smoke, retreating toward the inner gates with a fluid, rhythmic grace that defied the exhausted, jerky movements of the attackers. To the Roman eye, trained to recognize the signs of a breaking army, this was interpreted as the final collapse of the local will. The officers saw the retreating backs of the defenders and assumed the enemy had finally exhausted their supply of fervor, leaving only the hollow shell of a defeated priesthood. It was a logical, professional assessment, backed by the reality of the thousands of fallen left in the streets below, yet it failed to account for the strange, vibrating quality of the air within the court. The sensory landscape had shifted from the smell of the gutter to the cloying, suffocating sweetness of 1,000 years of ritual. The scent of heavy incense, released from shattered vessels in disturbed storerooms, mixed with the rising heat of the afternoon to create a thick, narcotic haze that seemed to distort distances and dampen sound. It was a smell that belonged to the divine, not the martial, and it acted as a solvent on the rigid discipline of the men. As the soldiers breathed in this alien atmosphere, the gray paste of limestone dust and remnants of the struggle that caked their armor began to feel like a second skin, a heavy, calcified layer that separated them from their past lives as citizens and farmers. They were no longer a military unit performing a task. They were becoming part of the very fever they had been sent to suppress. The rhythmic thud of their hearts, once synchronized by the cadence of the march, now beat with a frantic, disjointed energy that bordered on the intense. They looked at the white marble of the sanctuary and did not see a target, but an obsession, a shimmering prize that seemed to pulse with a light of its own, drawing them forward with a gravity that overrode the shouts of their commanders. Titus, standing upon the heights of the Antonia, saw the movement of his troops and felt the first tremor of a disconnect. From his elevated perspective, the flow of the legions looked correct, a massive, bronze-clad wave surging toward the heart of the city, but the quality of the motion was wrong. There was a lack of hesitation, a frightening absence of the cautious, incremental progress that defined Roman siegecraft. He sent messengers with orders for restraint, commanding the tribunes to halt the advance at the gates of the inner court, to allow for a formal parley or a structured assault. These orders were delivered. The scrolls passed from hand to hand. The trumpets sounded the familiar calls for a pause, but the signals seemed to evaporate in the thick, incense-laden air. The soldiers heard the trumpets, but the sound was interpreted not as a command to stop, but as a celebratory fanfare for a momentous conclusion. The chain of command, the very nervous system of the empire, was experiencing its first catastrophic failure of conduction. The brain was still issuing rational instructions, but the limbs had developed a will of their own, driven by extreme exhaustion and a feverish desire for the gold that lined the walls of the Holy of Holies. The error was compounded by the behavior of the defenders. The local fighters did not shout in fear as they were pushed back. They watched the Romans with eyes that were wide, glassy, and filled with a terrifying ecstasy. They retreated into the shadows of the inner gates, not as those yielding, but as priests leading a ceremony to the altar. To a rational Roman mind, this behavior was so alien that it was dismissed as simple trauma or the delirium of deprivation. They did not recognize it as the ultimate expression of a faith that viewed the destruction of the physical world as a prelude to a divine revelation. The legionaries, seeing this lack of conventional defense, pushed harder, their files compressing as they funneled toward the narrow entrances of the inner sanctuary. The density of the formation, which Titus had praised as the army's greatest shield, was now becoming a mechanism of entrapment. Men in the rear, unable to see the inner court but feeling the forward surge, pressed into the backs of those ahead, creating a hydraulic pressure that forced the front ranks into the dark, echoing maws of the temple gates. Inside the ranks, the silence of the officers was the most telling sign of the coming storm. The centurions, whose vine staves usually fell with rhythmic severity on the shoulders of any man who broke formation, were now staring at the sanctuary with the same glazed, intense focus as the common soldiers. The system of discipline and reward that held the legion together was being replaced by a singular, primal drive to reach the center of the light. They justified this momentum to themselves as the final pursuit of a fleeing foe, a necessary exertion to end the conflict in a single afternoon. But the reality was far more dangerous. They were losing the ability to distinguish between a military victory and a spiritual transgression. The air grew hotter, the smell of incense more oppressive, and the vibration in the earth more pronounced. Yet the Roman command continued to interpret these signs as the friction of a successful conquest. They believed they were in control of the narrative, that the surrender of the city was only minutes away, and that the order of the world would soon be restored. They did not see that the defenders were no longer fighting for the walls, but for the fire. The groups within were moving with a purpose that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with a final, cataclysmic transformation. As the first Roman foot stepped over the threshold of the inner court, the sun hit the gilded rafters of the temple with such intensity that for a moment, the entire world seemed to turn to white ash. In that moment of blindness, the last thread of Roman discipline snapped. It was not a sudden break, but a quiet, almost imperceptible melting away of authority. The soldiers did not charge, they flowed, a mindless, bronze-clad river of fury and exhaustion that no longer recognized the voice of its master. The machine was still moving, the gears were still turning, but the steering had been disconnected, and the engine was beginning to echo with the sound of 1,000 men who had forgotten how to be cautious. The stage was set for an erasure that would have no winners, a collision of two different kinds of fervor that would leave the world forever altered. And yet, on the maps of the staff officers, everything still looked perfectly, predictably on schedule. The air within the inner sanctuary had reached a point of saturation where it no longer supported the mechanics of breath, becoming instead a pressurized medium of dust, incense, and the rising, invisible ghost of heat. The Roman legions were no longer a tactical formation, but a calcified mass of bronze and remains, driven forward by a hydraulic pressure from the rear that ignored the cries of the front. They were following the standing orders of the empire, to advance, to occupy, to consolidate, but the environment had ceased to recognize the validity of these commands. The narrow corridors of the temple, designed for the quiet procession of priests, were now being force-fed 10,000 men in full battle kit, creating a friction that was literal and absolute. Every movement of a limb required the displacement of another man's frame. Every step forward was a victory of physics over the physical form. The Roman scutum, the very symbol of their collective invincibility, had been transformed by the crush into a personal iron vise, pinning the arms of the legionaries to their sides and turning their own protective plate into a conductor for the ambient temperature. The system was still functioning with a terrifying, mindless perfection. The centurions continued to signal for the push, their whistles and shouts echoing hollowly against the marble. And the men continued to obey because the alternative, the collapse of order, was more frightening than the slow suffocation of the press. They were fading according to the manual, maintaining their files even as the man to their left succumbed to thermal exhaustion, and the man to their right stumbled from the scent of scorched cedar. This was the terminal limit of Roman discipline, a state where the army was so well trained that it would continue to execute a maneuver long after the maneuver had become a fatal bond. They were a machine that had been geared for the open field, now grinding its iron teeth against the unyielding stone of a holy mountain. And the sparks generated by this collision were about to transform the world. The transition from a siege to a catastrophe was marked by a single, anonymous gesture that the history books would later struggle to name. In the intense center of the scramble, where the Roman line met the final, ecstatic defense of the defenders, a torch was hurled into the air. It did not fall as a piece of wood, but as a spark in a tinderbox of centuries. The flame caught the heavy, aromatic tapestries of the sanctuary, climbing the cedar of Lebanon that lined the walls with a predatory speed that defied the laws of combustion. In an instant, the fire did not merely burn, it roared, a high-pitched sound caused by the sudden expansion of air in the enclosed space. The gold that had stood for generations as a testament to the divine began to react to the thermal spike, its surface bubbling and weeping as the temperature climbed toward the melting point of the metal. To the soldiers trapped in the interior, the fire was not an enemy they could fight with steel, but a third army that had entered the fray with a mandate for total erasure. The heat reached a threshold where it turned the very oxygen into a weight, scorching the breath of those who tried to cry out and overwhelming the senses of the fallen. The Roman command structure, still attempting to issue orders for the preservation of the structure and the seizure of the treasury, was rendered obsolete by the physics of the furnace. The soldiers who had been driven by the hope of gain now found themselves staring at the very wealth they had come to claim, only to see it transform into a shimmering, liquid state. The gold on the rafters, once a distant, glittering promise, began to rain down in heavy, molten droplets that hissed as they struck the marble floors and the forms of the men below. This was the point where the system began to undo the very men it was designed to protect. The armor that had shielded the legionaries from the swords of the Gauls and the spears of the Greeks now became an enclosure of conductive bronze, absorbing the heat of the conflagration and trapping the heat within their own shells. They could not strip the plates away. The buckles were too hot to touch, and the press of bodies was too tight to allow for the movement. They stood in their ranks, holding their positions with an unnatural, involuntary rigidity, while the gold ran in incandescent rivers around their feet, sealing the exits with a cooling metallic crust. The rhythmic thud of 10,000 hearts, which had once been the pulse of the Roman war machine, was now a frantic, irregular drumming against the iron walls of their chests. They were no longer conquerors, they were fuel. The psychological dam broke not with a shout, but with a collective, silent realization that the rules of the world had been overwhelmed. The soldiers looked into the eyes of their opponents, who stood amidst the flames with their arms raised in feverish joy, and they saw a reflection of a fervor they could no longer comprehend. The Roman mind, built on the foundations of logic, law, and predictable outcomes, could not process a landscape where gold turned to water and stone turned to glass. The centurions stopped shouting. The trumpeters dropped their instruments, the bronze tubes clattering onto the floor to be swallowed by the rising tide of molten wealth. The discipline remained, but it was the discipline of the void, a hollow, mechanical adherence to a formation that was now nothing more than a structured way to end. Outside in the courts, the sun was still setting with a calm, indifferent beauty. But inside the temple, the Roman system had achieved its final, perfect form, a self-sustaining engine of erasure that consumed its own parts to keep the fire burning. The soldiers in the rear continued to push, unaware that they were driving their comrades into the mouth of a power that did not care for the Republic. They believed they were still winning, that the smoke was the sign of a broken enemy, and that the heat was merely the price of a hard-won day. They did not know that they were the last generation of a logic that was being melted down, that the very iron of their swords was softening in the heat, and that the only thing that would remain of their glorious advance would be the shapeless, cooling lumps of gold and remnants that would litter the floor of a ruin. The machine was still holding, the line was still straight, but the men inside were already flickering for a final, harrowing moment against the backdrop of a civilization being turned to dust. The structural integrity of the world had reached its terminal velocity, a point where the laws of architecture and the laws of warfare were being consumed by a heat that no longer belonged to the terrestrial realm. Inside the inner sanctum, the transition from a battle to a geological event was complete. Stones as large as houses, the massive white marble blocks that had stood as the foundations of a 1,000-year faith, began to groan with a sound that mimicked the tectonic shifting of the earth. It was a low, rhythmic thunder, a vibration that traveled through the soles of the Roman sandals and into the core of their being, signaling that the thermal expansion of the ancient masonry had exceeded its limits. When the stones finally cracked, the sound was not a snap, but a roar that overwhelmed the senses of the men standing nearest, sending avalanches of white-hot debris and razor-sharp limestone shards down upon the struggling masses. This was the first irreversible failure of the system. The very ground they had fought to occupy was now liquefying and collapsing. Yet the Roman machine, driven by a momentum that had become a physical curse, continued to feed more men into the abyss. The sky above Jerusalem had vanished, replaced by a bruised and swollen canopy of purple and black smoke that seemed to press down on the city like a suffocating hand. This was the exhaled breath of a civilization being erased by flame, a toxic cloud composed of vaporized cedar, scorched silk, and the fine golden dust of the sanctuary. The sun was no longer a source of light, but a dull copper coin flickering behind a curtain of soot, casting a monochrome, ominous glow over the devastation below. In this half-light, the Roman legions ceased to be an army of the Republic and became a collection of shadows, their individual identities burned away by the sheer intensity of the sensory overload. The veteran legionaries, men who had maintained their composure through the most severe campaigns of the century, now found their minds fracturing under the weight of a reality that no longer obeyed the rules of logic. The discipline that had been their pride was now the instrument of their undoing. Because they were trained not to break, they remained in their files as the fire surrounded them, maintaining the formation even as the ground beneath them turned into a slurry of ash and molten metal. The mechanism of the trap was fueled by the fatal disconnect between the front and the rear of the Roman column. The soldiers in the outer courts, unable to see the furnace of the interior, but hearing the muffled roar of the conflict, continued to push forward with a mechanical, mindless intensity. They believed they were reinforcing a victory, adding their weight to a final surge that would break the last of the resistance. This pressure transmitted through the mass of the army like a shock wave through water, forcing the men in the center deeper into the burning ruins of the temple. There was no longer a front line to defend or a rear guard to protect. There was only a swirling vortex of intensity where the Roman and the defender were bound together by the heat. The scutum, the gladius, and the pilum were no longer tools of war, but conductors for the thermal spike. The iron softening and bending in the hands of the soldiers who still tried to wield them according to the manual. They were executing the maneuvers of the drill field in a landscape where the air itself had become a liquid weapon, their movements jerky and puppet-like as their physical forms began to falter from the dehydration and the heat. The struggle had changed quality. It was no longer a tactical necessity or a release of rage, but a desperate, rhythmic labor intended to silence the unbearable noise of the fading city. The cries of the faithful, trapped in the Holy of Holies, had merged with the roar of the conflagration to create a wall of sound that was more painful than the fire itself. The Romans began to strike at anything that moved, their blades rising and falling with a repetitive industrial cadence, as if by clearing the space of the living, they could somehow dampen the echoes in the thunder of the falling stones. They were striking for silence, searching for a moment of stillness in a world that was exploding in every direction. This was the final, perfect form of their order, a mindless, automatic erasure that continued because the machine had no off switch, a system that had been designed to dominate life and was now perfecting the administration of the end. They were lost in a landscape where the physical limits of human endurance had been incinerated. The armor that had once been their protection was now a glowing cage. The buckles fused, the leather straps charred into brittle flakes. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, those who had fallen and those who remained, held upright by the sheer density of the press, a solidified strata of bronze and forms that moved as a single, agonizing organism. They did not retreat because the concept of retreat required a direction. And in the swirling smoke and the falling fire, there was no longer a north or a south, only the center of the flame. The authority of the centurions had been replaced by the authority of the fire. The vine staves were gone, burned to ash, and the men who had held them were now just more fuel for the fire. The Roman Republic, with all its laws and its geometry, had been reduced to a frantic, disjointed struggle for a final, scorched breath. As the afternoon stretched toward its terminal point, the realization of their own irrelevance began to settle over the survivors like a shroud. They were no longer the protagonists of their own history. They were merely the friction that kept the fire burning, the physical presence required to sustain the transformation of a holy city into a blackened ruin. The system had won, but it was a victory of the void. The order had been maintained, the ranks were still technically in place, and the objective had been reached, but the cost was the total loss of the men who had achieved it. They were shadows flickering against a wall of flame, waiting for the final avalanche of stone to silence the thumping of their hearts. And as the Temple of Jerusalem began its final, majestic collapse, the Roman legions stood their ground, maintaining the formation until the very end. because the discipline of the empire was the only thing they had left to hold on to in a world that had forgotten the meaning of the word mercy. When the sun finally climbed above the horizon on the morning after the temple fell, it did not bring the warmth of a new day, but the cold, monochrome revelation of a world that had been scoured of its soul. The light was clinical and indifferent, illuminating a landscape that had been terraformed by conflict into a blackened plateau of ash and cooling iron. The silence that gripped the city was more unsettling than the roar of the fire had been. It was a heavy, airless void, a vacuum where the prayers of 1,000 years had been replaced by the sound of wind whistling through the hollow sockets of ruined towers. There were no birds to greet the dawn, no sounds of the struggle, only the settling of dust and the occasional, distant crack of a cooling stone. Jerusalem was no longer a city of the divine or a city of men. It was a geography of erasure, a place where the concept of a future had been consumed along with its past. The Roman soldiers wandered through this gray wasteland like ghosts who had forgotten the way to the underworld. Their faces were marked by the furnace, their spirits hollowed out by the realization of what they had unleashed in the intensity of the previous night. They moved through the ash-covered streets without the swagger of victors, their hands hanging limp at their sides, their eyes fixed on a horizon that no longer offered the promise of a meaningful return. They had executed every order, they had maintained every formation, and they had achieved the total destruction of their objective. Yet they stood amidst the ruins with the hollow, vibrating gait of the defeated. They had won the city, but in the process they had lost the ability to understand why they had fought for it in the first place. The discipline of the legion, which had been their anchor for 1,000 miles of conquest, now felt like a heavy, rusted chain dragging them down into the soot. Among the charred remains of the inner sanctum, where the air still shimmered with the ghost of the heat, they found the gold they had coveted for so many months of deprivation. It was no longer the shimmering wealth of the stories, nor the stamped and orderly currency of the empire. It had become something grotesque, shapeless, dull lumps of metal that had cooled in the cracks of the marble floor, fused with the calcified remnants of the sanctuary and the scorched fragments of the holy tapestries. This was the final census of their triumph, a horde of ruined nodules that had no value, no beauty, and no history. They looked at the prize and felt only a cold, leaden weight in their chests, a physical manifestation of the vacuum that now occupied the space where their pride used to be. The victory was not a celebration, it was a tomb, and they were the mourners who had been forced to build it with their own hands. The system of the Republic had reached its logical conclusion, proving that it could indeed dismantle any obstacle and silence any defiance. But it had failed to provide a reason to continue existing once the work was done. As the legions finally began to assemble for the long march back toward the sea and the eventual triumph in Rome, they did so with a mechanical, joyless precision. They carried the heavy vessels and the sacred objects, but these items felt like leaden anchors rather than trophies. They were marching away from a void they had created, carrying with them a darkness that no amount of Roman sunlight could ever illuminate. The road ahead was long, but they knew, with a certainty that transcended military intelligence, that the Rome they were returning to would never be the same, and that the men who had stood in the fire of Jerusalem would spend the rest of their lives trying to wash the scent of the fallen temple from their skin. The war was over, the map was complete, and the only thing that remained was the silence of a world that had seen the end of its own logic.